seemed like one of the guys, and very nice man, and we all enjoyed him as we enjoy everybody who comes to visit us in Virginia Beach, and we were all enthusiastic about what he was doing and who he was. But then he invited us down to Houston, where he has his offices, and we found this very professional setting that was just like top of the line, everything very professional. But there's the two sides of Rod. There's the one of us person and very professional person, and he set up classes for Paul. We had hundreds of people in the audience, and then he took us all around Houston, and we just had a ball. So this is a very wonderful man, very professional man, and he's a great speaker. So you're really in for a treat. He's going to speak about 3 conditions of unconditional love. Rob Penny, Dr. Rob Penny.
Thank you so much. Is this looking okay, Stephen? Okay, great. So I want to just thank everybody for the opportunity to be here today. This is always a special thing. I remember in 1977 when I went for my first family gathering was an advanced ILC course, and that changed my life. It planted some important seeds in me because I had this experience that I just want to highlight a quote from Henry Thoreau. It says, "We mark with light in the memory the few interviews we've had in the dreary years of routine and of sin with souls who made our souls wiser, who spoke what we thought, who told us what we knew, who gave us leave to be what we inly were." And I think I experienced that a lot with the fellowship and the family. And just so you don't have to try and capture all this, I'm putting in the chat a link to download everything from today, from what I'm doing. But, you know, this is wonderful when it happens, when we have these moments. But the challenge is it's not easy to maintain those moments. I have experience with my wife, Claire. I don't know if you've all had this kind of experience, but in our shower, we have this button you push that sends water down into the tub or up through the shower. And I always had it go up through the shower, and I'd turn the water on and put my hand in and feel it till it got to what I wanted as a temperature. I get and take a shower, and then I get out. And then Claire would come, and she'd expect the water to come down from the faucet, and she'd lean her head in to feel the water. Where's the water coming from? Hit her in the head. And then I'd hear, "Rob, what do? You left the water on everything." And I mean, my thought is, well, don't stick your head in. You know, and we would get into these arguments that were painful because they would just go on and on and on. And I don't know why. I don't know why I was so unconscious about it. I think we all just get stuck in our emotional habits. But one time I was getting ready to turn the shower off, and I just happened to think of what was going to happen. And all I had to do was just push that plunger in. And the neat thing is, when Claire puts her hand in and the water hits her hand, how's she going to feel? She's going to feel loved. And that's how I want her to feel, because she does nice things when she feels loved. And so this was an important lesson that I want to reinforce in a number of ways, but it starts with the idea that I think we all know that, you know, babies are born without any self-doubt. We're all loved at the moment we're born. And we learn the fear. We learn that we have to keep reawakening the experience of love as we go through life, and there are things that get in the way of it. And the more we can be aware of it, the more we can remember, for instance, when someone is broken, you don't try to fix them. You can't. You know, that was a challenging thing for me as a counselor. You know, sometimes people will be sitting there and I'm thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing, and they're paying me. Brian, you ever had that feeling? And I just learned to trust that they're here for a reason and I'm here for a reason, and good things can happen. And that helped me just love them, really. When someone is hurting, don't try to take away their pain. Again, you can't. But what you can do is just walk beside them, just be with them. Claire used to call it resonance. Like on a guitar, when you hit one string, the other strings kind of vibrate. Just learning to be with someone, you know, the need is simply to know that they aren't alone. A lot of times I've found it even physically healing to be just present with someone's pain. And so these are the things that are important to do, but we got to be able to do it ourselves. And part of the challenge I've run into a lot is, when we fall in love and we say, I love you, and the other person says, I love you, we think we're saying the same thing. When I say I love you, I have a lot of ideas about what a loving person would do. If you love me, you do this and this and this and this. And they have a bunch of ideas about what a loving person would do. The problem is we don't ever describe those things. We don't put them out. And so then when we run into the conflicts, like, the toilet paper is supposed to go this way, or the plunger in the shower is supposed to go this way, or you squeeze the toothpaste, what happens is we question whether or not they love us, because in our mind we go, well, if they loved me, they wouldn't do that. There's a wonderful film I'd like to everybody go find somewhere called Best Friends with Goldie Hawn and Burt Reynolds, and they were best friends, and they were screenwriters in Hollywood, and they decided who better to marry than your best friend, and they got married, and then they did a road trip, which they hadn't done before, to visit their families. And they discovered all of these unconscious, unstated rules about what is done in one family that's not done in another family. And I think that's just a tremendous thing for us to be aware of, that when you think about relationships, it's really not just about what we say when we say I love, because that sets expectations. And whenever it doesn't get met, it's so painful. We all know that like 50% of marriages end in divorce. And my experience of doing marriage counseling for 30 years is I only found one couple that I didn't think was ever in love. But I think they all were in love, but then they got hurt and angry because someone wasn't doing what they thought love was. And that helped me to realize that it's because they didn't agree. And I think that gave me this new insight that relationships are defined by agreements. What are we agreeing to? And, I think we put a lot more thought into like what we want to agree to when we're going to buy a car. We make a whole list of all the things that we want to buy in a car. But in a relationship, we tend not to do that. We're looking for this emotional reaction, maybe this physical attraction reaction. But the relationship is all of this unstated agreements. And if we don't get clarity about that, it can create pain and suffering, and it can go over generations. So, it's easy to assume that a lack of agreement means a lack of love. And that's something just to kind of filter in your mind. But there should be some limits, some requirements that doesn't have anything to do with whether or not we love each other. I remember one time I was kind of frustrated with Paul. And I remember going to him and say, Paul, I want to change our relationship. I don't want to work for you anymore, especially since you're not paying me, but I'd like to work with you, and I'm not sure what that is. And he was like, no, this is the way we do it, and so if you want to do it, you do it this way. And I was like, well, I don't want to do it that way. And at the time I thought, well, how close-minded was he? But later on, I think I came to the realization that, he was being very clear about what he thought worked for him and worked and he was successful with. And so we kind of parted ways for a while. A few years later, I remember he reached out to me and said, hey, we're creating some new things. I'd like you to be involved. And I was like, cool. Now it's a whole different kind of agreement. And that worked really, really well. And then we had the experience that Sharon was talking about earlier. But I think it's very important to realize that love is not putting up with however bad someone behaves. That's what not unconditional love is, just putting up with anything. I mean, even Jesus said, if someone slaps you on the cheek, turn him the other one. But I think he didn't say every time, forever. I think there's limits. Love does not tolerate abuse. Love forgives, but loving yourself requires healthy agreements, and people who do not yet know how to love, you got to have agreements with them. And you got to be clear about what your agreements are, what your requirements are. Here's a great quote from Sylvester McNutt. Don't give fourth and fifth chances for people to keep hurting you like they did the first, second, and third time. Be forgiving, but not stupid. These aren't mistakes. These are behaviors. Don't feel guilty for walking away from destructive behavior. So we all need to know kind of what our limits are in our relationships so that we can make sure that we're doing what's supportive for you and what's supportive for me. And I think that's what makes a difference in our ability to be successful. So I have this important idea that's built on some of the things I think, Sally was saying and what Alicia was saying, that forgiveness is not for the other person. I think they could care less whether or not you forgive them. You forgive someone for yourself. You forgive someone to no longer continue the harm. We were talking during the break there. I think something that Paul said is that guilt is really good for about a second and a half. Its purpose is to get your attention that something you're doing may not be in your best interest. And so the appropriate response is to make a change. But we're often afraid of changing in a relationship because then we'll lose the relationship. And then the fear is we'll never find anybody else. And I think that keeps us in relationships where our agreements are not met and we're afraid to even be clear with ourselves about what we want someone to agree to. So if you have any thoughts or comments at any time, please drop it into the chat. That would be helpful. So I think all you ever have to forgive in another person is their ignorance that they're not loved and that they think you're not too. I mean, the guy who shot me, you all know the story about me getting shot in the center of my chest by an unknown assailant. I mean, I forgive him for his ignorance that he thought that was the best way to be successful in life. Because if he didn't have that thought, that's not a behavior he could have done. And I think that's really fundamentally all you ever have to do is forgive people their ignorance. But that doesn't mean that I would not vote to have him locked up, because as long as he has that belief, he's dangerous, obviously. So it's important to distinguish between the love that you have for people and the requirements you have for a relationship to work. Those are different things. You can love everybody. I think that's our purpose here. But in relationships, there needs to be a clarity of what it is that we're agreeing to in this relationship. In my experience of doing marriage counseling, it's hardly anybody ever does that. I remember I was fortunate to perform the marriage for my nephew and his wife. And I gave them this book on 365 questions you should answer before you get married. There are a bunch of them out there on Amazon. I mean, how many of us even answered 5 questions? Let alone 365 or something. And, even the quote, forgive them, for they know not what they do, I think applies to a lot of things. But that doesn't mean you have to teach them what they did wrong. I think that's a problem that we have, is that we can't let go of somebody until they understand what they did wrong. And if they were going to understand what they did wrong, they probably might not have done it in the first place, or you'd have a whole different quality of relationship. But it's almost like if we can't get them to understand and appreciate why we're no longer going to let them abuse us, then we can't leave. And you got to let everybody have their own lessons. And in that process, I think it's real important. There are times when you need to be alone. And I think forgiving does not require you to continue in the relationship in the way that I'm talking about it. And Paul had a great quote. I love this. He said, if a person has to hit bottom before they can accept responsibility for their actions, the most loving thing you can do is help them get there as quick as possible. And our codependence in loving someone who's, being self-destructive, we kind of want to prevent them from harming themselves. And it's okay to try and see if they have any openness to it. I've kind of learned that a requirement for me for someone to be ready to hear something that would be helpful to them is not just that they're asking, but are they paying me? Usually people aren't that open to hearing what they need to hear. And so Paul said, okay, well, if that's what's required, let's get them there as quick as possible. And I thought that was brilliant. So I think it is important that we forgive and release people to their highest good. We all have people who felt betrayed by, etc. So forgive and release them to their highest good. But I think it's also important to do it to ourselves. Forgive and release me to my highest good. I remember when I was first divorced, and my business partner, Daniel Emmanuel, lived in the same apartment complex as my first wife. And I would go over and pick him up on the way out to our offices, and I would, always be thinking about my wife and going, I forgive and release you to your highest good. I forgive and release me to my highest good. I think those are important processes to keep the experience healthy. So I'm just curious, by show of hands, is there anybody here who ever worries about someone you care about? Isn't that kind of like a habit we all have? Well, I think that's true. We've been taught to do that. I mean, how many of you come from a long line of worriers? Anybody? It's like a family tradition, passed from one generation to the next. I mean, how many of you ever had someone say this to you? Of course I worry, it's because I love you. And how many of you said that or thought that? But, that's not what love is. If you think about it, worry, the definition of worry is thinking horrible, disastrous, terrible thoughts. So let's translate that sentence, of course I worry, it's because I love you. How about, of course I think horrible, disastrous, terrible thoughts about you, it's because I love you. Now, that doesn't sound very loving, because it's not. Love is the ability to imagine those you love as if their lessons are already learned. It's imagining that they can handle the challenges of their life. It's being able to think of them as you believe they can be. That doesn't mean you have to be there all the time they're struggling, but you can hold the image in your mind about their eventual success. I think that's what prayer is to see the person whole and complete and having learned their lesson. The problem is it might take them lifetimes to do it, and you did your job with the prayer. You don't have to be the punching bag the whole time for them to learn the lesson. This is part of the process. But you can't do it for someone else if you haven't learned to do it yourself. And that's learning how to forgive yourself quicker, learning how to remind yourself that it's okay to be you with your strengths and your weaknesses and your successes and your failures, that the whole ball of wax is okay to be. And I think the more you know that about you, the more compassion and empathy you're going to have for everybody else and the struggles that they have and learning their lessons. And I think, I believe that in the eternity of time, everyone's going to learn their lessons. In the Course in Miracles, it says, who could flee forever from the truth? And so I believe that. I believe eventually everybody's going to realize they're loved. Now, it may take many lifetimes. I mean, someone asked Buddha, how many times have we been doing this? How many lifetimes? And he said, like, the leaves on the trees. So we get a lot of chances. I think it would be an extremely cruel God that gives us like one shot at figuring it all out. And if we didn't, hell forever. I think, no, that's not my God. And we don't do that to our own children. So how can we think the source of love would be less than that? So, being able to do it for yourself is real important. And to do that, then I think you'll be able to apply my paradoxical 3 conditions for unconditional love. So think about somebody, that you have a little challenge with. And let me tell you my 3 conditions, see what you think about them. The first condition is that it's okay they're on the planet. Just like somewhere. Just make it okay that they're like here, somewhere doing their thing. So are you willing to make it okay? Is it okay with you that that person's on the planet? Okay. Now the second condition is that it's okay they have their unlearned lessons. Now, as a psychologist, there's so many theories of personality and so many theories of psychotherapy, and it's just too complicated. So I've made it very simple. My belief is your personality is defined by 2 things. The lessons you've learned and the lessons you haven't learned yet. And all your stress is about an unlearned lesson. If you knew how to handle it, it wouldn't be stressful. And so that's true about you. It's true about everybody else. And so, in essence, when you're, being in a relationship with someone, the way I'd say it is, when you marry someone, what you marry are their unlearned lessons. You don't marry who you want them to become. That's not who they are. Who they are is their lessons they've learned and their lessons that they haven't learned. So it's good to find that out before you make that agreement. And, learning about their past relationships and their family and all that kind of stuff, good place to learn about what their unlearned lessons are. So you just make it okay that they have them, since everybody does. And, when you do that, it's part of realizing the great insight that Paul shared with all of us about the concept that life's a mystery school. And the mystery is we don't know what our lessons are. But stress is evidence of an unlearned lesson. And one of the most profound transformations anybody can make in the whole path of enlightenment is just beginning to consider that they've got something to do with how they're feeling. And once a person begins to make that kind of shift, then all of a sudden they're not just starting to explore responsibility for emotion, but then for thought, because that's what causes emotion. Unless you got chemical or neurological damage, how you think causes how you feel. And then that causes how you behave. And then that produces results in your life. And you start to take responsibility for what you're producing. And in relationships, I think it's primarily about the agreements that we make, and to learn how to be more conscientious about those and what those might be. So here's the third condition, and that is I will only make supportive agreements. So a supportive agreement is agreement that supports me and supports them. And I have to be in agreement about both of those. Let's say I fall in love with someone who's just in the middle of breaking up from a relationship. So how ready are they to be in a relationship? I mean, they probably want to be, so they can just avoid all the pain they went through. But my guess is, they're just going to carry it into the next one. I mean, I had a client once who married 8 times, and her complaint was they were all the same. And my reaction was, surprise, surprise, surprise. And I didn't say that. But, like, what's the common denominator here? So it wouldn't be a supportive agreement to make that kind of commitment with someone who needed time to heal and change. My wife passed away some years ago, and I have come to clarity about an agreement that is a requirement of mine for any relationship I'm going to get in the future, and that is that they have demonstrated their willingness to look at their responsibility for how they're feeling. Now, I mean, if they're not willing to do that, who are they going to consider responsible for how they're feeling? I don't want that. They'll have to pay me to deal with that. I don't want to do that. So I have to have evidence that they've done this. Now, by the way, I do admit this kind of very severely shrinks the potential pool of possibilities. But I think it's smart for me, and that's what I'm looking for. So that's the third condition. And I think our relationships, we do need to have requirements. And one of the things is that I want to emphasize is that there's a difference between a requirement and a preference. So a requirement is an agreement that's not negotiable. This is like not debatable. This is a deal breaker. You agree to this, or we don't even consider it, or it's over. And I think we need to be clear with ourselves to make that third condition of making supportive agreements. What are our requirements? That we're not willing to be in the relationship if this is not met. And it could be anything. I think I came down to and all the struggles in my marriage was monogamy. I thought that was pretty important. So if Claire came one time and said, hey, that agreement we have about monogamy, well, I think I'd like to renegotiate that. And I would go, well, you can renegotiate your bed out the door because that's not negotiable. And the other one, I think, was that you're willing to look at what you have to do with when you're feeling upset, And she was willing to do that, or get therapy, or take medication, or whatever. But to be willing to take some responsibility for how you're feeling, when you're real clear about what your requirements are, what I discovered is, by definition, everything else is not required. It might be a preference. I mean, I'd really like it. For instance, when I met Claire, she was working. And my first wife worked, and my mother worked outside the home all the time. And so what's my belief about wives? Wives work outside the home. They've got a job, etc. And, that was fine. And after we were married about a year, Claire got laid off. And that's understandable. Things like that happen. And, a couple of months went by, and she hadn't gotten a job. And a couple of more months went by, and she still hadn't got a job. Finally, I was like, okay, when are you going to get up there and get that job? And she was like, why? And I'm like, what do you mean, why? And she said, well, I'm married. I don't have to work. I was like, what? See, I did know that her mother never worked outside the house. And I did know that when she was married before, she didn't work. But I wasn't clear with myself or with her about that. So now we're in the middle of a relationship, and all of a sudden this expectation I have comes up, and now I've got a decision. Is it going to be a requirement of mine? Every woman I marry has to work and make money. And I decided no. It's a preference. If she ever came and said, hey, I'm really just tired of sitting around the house spending your money. I'd like to go out and make some. I'd go, bravo, great idea. But it wasn't a requirement. And so, I got no emotion about it. I agreed. I decided it's between me and me. And so everything else is a preference. And I think it's real important to know the distinction between these, and you might need a little more extra support to learn about this. So I've got a whole blog post and a video and everything. My second wife threatened to divorce me. It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And there's the link. And again, let me just put it again in the chat for those who came in a little late. This is where you can get the handouts with all the links and everything to it. And then one other thing I'd like to share here, another kind of resource, that experience I was sharing you about the shower. I have a video on it, and Goldcast took it and just did an amazing thing. I cried when I saw it. Added music, added words, added B-roll pictures. You can do a search here for it. It just was remarkable. And I would recommend, it's only about 3 minutes, but 3.5 million people saw it. It's amazing. A lot of what I'm sharing, that story is also in my book. Let me do a little plug. In chapter 7, it's the little things that create love or pain. And, I do have an opinion that the purpose of marriage is to discover all the ways in which you don't love each other. And if you go into it with that purpose, then what you're uncovering is all these beliefs and expectations about what love is, which helps you discover what love really is. And, Claire and I had some really difficult, challenging times, but we ended up in a very loving place. And I remember as she was dying, I was saying, let's next time, let's begin here. We've gone through so much to get to such a loving, wonderful place with each other. Let's begin here. And she agreed. If you'd like more on how to move through stress quicker and some other videos and workbooks and everything, here you can just text to this number, and it'll ask you for your email, and then they'll get an email with a whole bunch of stuff and then some follow-up things too. The thing about the shower, and I learned that when I put that plug in, I'm thinking that Claire's going to feel loved, which made me feel loved. And even though she's now passed away for 11 years, something like that, I still push the plunger in. I still feel loved. And I think that's what we want to really learn how to do, is use the intensity of our relationships to learn how to be a more effective, loving, successful, amazing human being. And fortunately, it's set up that way for us to do it. And you've accomplished it when the circumstances are not any different than they are, but your experience is different. And I think that's what the criteria for success in this mystery school is. And I'm very grateful to Paul and all the people in the fellowship who've given me so many tools that have helped me do this. I think it's just been really wonderful. So my time is pretty much up. I got a minute left. So, if anybody's got any other questions or something, I'm really happy to entertain the questions, because I know lots of stuff.
He does.
Any thoughts,
great,
comments?
That was great. That was great, Rob, as usual.
Thanks,
I have
John.
a question.
Great talk.
Took me a while to
Appreciate
find
your
some-
professional opinion there, John.
Well done, Rob.
Thanks, Brian. Jerry?
Can I throw in my question?
Sure.
Okay. One of the hardest parts of the job that I had as a school psychologist was how to connect to people who were not verbal. I mean, profoundly not verbal.
On the autism scale?
Sometimes autism, sometimes IQ, sometimes God only knows.
Yeah.
I've seen all three. And I know you must have encountered them, right? Someone comes to you and says, our marriage needs work, and then you meet the other party. The words just don't come out of them. What do you do?
Writing. I have found writing is hugely powerful for those who have difficulty verbalizing. And I think it also, if they're having difficulty verbalizing, then they're having difficulty absorbing everybody else's verbal stuff.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it would just be a few sentences written back and forth to each other. And that can open the door. And a lot of times when you're saying something to someone, I have found that a lot of times people are thinking about what they're going to say in response. But if you write something to them, what I've discovered is that people tend to read what you've written multiple times. So it's real important to do that when you're giving them a compliment. It goes deeper in the brain. But I think it's also good when you're inviting them to begin to discover a way of dealing with an issue. I would like to highlight, I'm going to put something else in the chat. Successfulworkrelationships.com is our website on our communication skills. And there's a lot of, there's a little 3-minute video in there about how to empty someone of their ideas so there's room for yours. And also, Virginia Satir's 5 levels of a clear communication. And then Stephen and I put together 6 stages in reaching a supportive agreement. Successfulworkrelationships.com. And that's all free. But there's also this emotional wave that hits us in the middle of an argument that causes us to forget any communication skill. And if you go to speedthroughstress.com, put that in the chat. That's a 20-minute video of me talking about when I got shot, and then a workbook on how to practice the how to speed through stress in 5 steps in 15 seconds process. Not for health, but for dealing with that communication, that overwhelming emotion that makes it difficult for us to communicate well. One other thing in response to your thing, I think sometimes just being quiet and being present and just being willing to sit with patience. Because I learned with my daughter, who was difficult to communicate with, that if I could imagine how she would be when she's learned the lesson in the middle of her not learning it, like she would get in the car and slide underneath the dashboard and go, 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 because she was embarrassed about the car I had when I picked her up from school. And so I would imagine her getting in and going, "Hi, Rob, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to pick me up. I really appreciate that. Would you mind, can I get you an ice cream cone?" So that would be my experience. And
Your answer was helpful. Thank
I
you.
think that's the practical application. So
I'll
somebody,
spare you the
Steve, I don't want to
story,
take
but it
over
was
your
helpful.
time, Stephen. You're coming up here.
No problem. They're just going to have less time to eat.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate again. I mean, the gatherings have always been life-changing experience and a lot of hard opportunity. Love to see y'all.
Thank you for being here.
Amen.